Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this public lecture by Dr. Maggie Atkinson, the Children's Commissioner for England. Her lecture will be on children's rights for the 21st century. Maggie was appointed as the Children's Commissioner in March 2010, and she's been in that role since, and it's a very important role, as you will expect, and part of that role is to bring to government's attention and others' who have got an interest in children's matters, issues which affect children and young people. Her role is to ensure policies and laws affecting children and young people are influenced by their wishes and aspirations, and that their rights are promoted and protected in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was ratified by the UK government way back in 1991. Maggie herself has said she works on the assumption that children and young people are citizens and have much to offer and a right to be heard. Maggie went to comprehensive school education before going to Cambridge, where she graduated in 1978. She then went on to undertake teacher training at the University of Sheffield, where she trained to teach English, history, and drama. She then had a very successful teaching career over a decade in 2 schools, and taught English and drama, and in a sense finished her teaching career as head of English and drama in her second school. From 1989, she worked first on the National Curriculum Initiative and then in local education authorities, both in urban settings as well as in the Shire counties. Her focus was on advice, inspection, training, and the management of change. In 2003, Maggie became the Chief Education Officer in Gateshead, Tyne and Wear, and from 2005 to 2010, she was the first Director of Children's Services at Gateshead. Whilst she was at Gateshead, she was also, in 2008, the President of the Association of Directors of Children's Services. Maggie is also very well known to Keele because she obtained her doctorate from our university here, a doctorate, Ed.D. doctorate in education, in 2008. And in 2010, she was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Northumbria, recognizing her life's work with children and young people. Maggie chaired the National Expert Group on Children and Young People's Workforce in 2008 and was then inaugural chair of the National Children and Young People's Workforce Partnership. She is now a member of the Secretary of State for Health's Children's Outcomes Framework Strategy Group, a leading thinker for National Education Trust, and an advisor to the Creative Learning Alliance. As you can see, Maggie has had a very distinguished career, both in children's education and with children's services more broadly, and it's indeed a privilege and pleasure for us to have her here at Keele today to give the public lecture, Children's Rights in the 21st Century. Maggie.
Thank you. You know those moments where somebody's just spoken about you and you think, who are they talking about? I've just had another of those moments. You won't need to take copious or detailed notes because after this evening I will get a PDF version of what I'm going to say to you back to the university, and it will go onto your networks so that you can just simply access what I'm going to say. I'd like to thank Keele for giving me the opportunity to make this address. I am, as Ram has just said, a doctoral alumna of this great university, and simply delighted to be here this evening after opening your day nursery earlier in the day and meeting some splendid young people, one of whom explained, as 3-year-olds are wont to do, that the reason why the witch in the picture couldn't make a spell was because she didn't have a wand. And he had that look on his face as if to say, "How stupid are you?" Which brought me down to earth. Keele has a really distinguished history of being one of those academic institutions that urges its students at all levels, and therefore the society they go on to serve in leadership positions, to look at why we are as we are and how we can go on striving as a people to improve. I hope this lecture you will find firmly fixed in that tradition. There were some teaser questions posed for those of you who picked up the publicity materials ahead of this lecture, like, did we mean it when we signed the United Nations Convention, and do we understand what children's rights actually mean? The answer to those questions could, if I were being humorous, be, how long have you got? Because I, as I hope I'll prove to you, consider that we have some distance to travel. But let me just focus, because we could be here all week. We could talk the good talk, but I just want us to focus somewhat. I could talk to you about a huge amount of things that we're doing. We're exploring the nature and the horrors of the sexual exploitation of children, not only because of the Rochdale case and ones like it, but also because we hear from children across the country that it's a far greater set of issues than we are yet likely to want to face. And they are horrible issues, and we will report at the end of November on what we found across the country, not only in particular sorts of communities or particular ethnic, cultural or religious settings, but across the country. So do look out for that report. I could talk to you about school exclusion. I could talk to you about asylum seeker children. I could talk to you about children whose parents abuse alcohol. We have done research on these and many, many more. Please do visit my website. If you Google Children's Commissioner, I'm kind of the first or second organisation that comes up, and all of what we write and publish is on my website. And we tweet, and we blog, and all of those other things that people who understand technology do. I want us to consider this evening what we actually want for our children and young people, how we balance their entitlements with keeping them safe and healthy, educating them, and making them ready to be adults in their turn. Key to the address, given the straitened times in which so many of us live, times that directly affect children's lives, will be the issues of the experience of childhood in adversity. And by that term, I mean not only the economic and financial issues that face us all in England at the moment, but the issues that children face because they are, by dint of their being children, vulnerable. And also because, as a society, we are uncertain exactly what we want for or think about very many of them. I'll do all I can to illustrate what I say this evening with what they say to me. So do be prepared to be challenged, because children do not pull their punches. I want to talk about children and young people's rights, how we define and legislate for them, and therefore the context, as Rama said, for everything I do as Children's Commissioner. And I want to go on to reflect on what a rights-based approach to services for them might look like. And I want to focus on some key areas of concern from the many I listed earlier. A key theme, adversity, means whatever comes at you in your life to assail you or waylay you, to stop you in your tracks, to try to turn you back. So we could, as I said, be here for several hours talking about that and talk a really good talk. But I must state clearly that what we do with what we know, not just talking about it, is what makes the difference. And my challenge to all of us, therefore, is that we do. I did come into this role in March 2010 after a very long career, and my remit as Commissioner focuses on the notion that children and young people need a statutory champion to speak for their rights and to defend their place in society. They need my advocacy most when they are least easy to relate to, least easy to like, least easy to listen to or support. I am that national statutory champion for England's children and young people's voices and views, and I stand foursquare to protect and promote their rights. A 2010 review of my role will be followed during 2013 or 14, or something with a teen in it, by legislation which will change what the Commissioner actually does. We'll feature, we think, in a forthcoming bill alongside issues of adoption, child protection, family law and special educational needs. Not surprisingly, given that very complex list of topics, it will take until about 2014 to pass the legislation, and until we are stopped, we will therefore do what we do at my office. Please do follow us on Twitter. The Guardian does, so you're in good company. And please retweet what we do. Where the voice of the child indicates it's needed, it's my job to call for change in both policy and practice on everything to do with children and young people. I do that work for all 11.8 million children in England, but by law, I must have a particular regard for the most vulnerable, marginalised and voiceless. I have the unique right of entry into any setting where a child or young person is deemed cared for, except their private homes, and when I get there, I must seek their views, and if I wish to do so and they give their permission, I seek their views in private, without the presence of influencing adults. That unique right is very important as I fulfil the UK's obligations under a United Nations optional protocol to its Convention Against Torture. That protocol focuses on the degree to which, if you've lost your liberty, you are or could be deemed to be suffering from cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. The punishment is the loss of your liberty, not that you are degraded and humiliated once you are behind bars. So I go into criminal justice settings, asylum detention, secure and forensic mental health, and police cell premises when I have the resources to do so, to seek out cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. The vision and priorities I work to, and therefore the work of my office, take very serious account of, but cannot solely be directed, purely by the views of children and young people. Preparation for this evening, however, has included an online straw poll of my Children and Young People's Advisory Group. They want me to talk to you about how society fulfills its promises to them. So my work starts with what children tell me, and if you work for, or you are training people who will work for, children and young people, so should yours. However difficult it is to remember, even in English society, to accept that children are rights holders on their own behalf. Children thrive when they are actively involved in shaping decisions that affect their lives, when they're supported to achieve their potential, have access to appropriate services which they have also helped to shape and evaluate, where they live in homes and communities where their rights are respected and their responsibilities learned. They are citizens now, not in waiting. Children should be able to tell me how they know they make a difference to the way services work, including by having any complaints they might make taken seriously. They should enjoy their rights, as Rama mentioned in his introduction, under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we signed in 1991 under John Major's government. The UNCRC is the United Nations' most signed human rights treaty. There are 3 nations on this planet which have not yet signed it. One is brand new, that's South Sudan. The other 2 are Somalia and the United States. The United States, because it believes, we think, that its Universal Declaration on the Rights of Man trumps any United Nations treaty. Somalia for reasons of its own, and South Sudan because it's still thinking about it. We signed it, we ratified it, we are therefore a states party, and although it's not incorporated in United Kingdom law, it is bound to us and we are bound to it by the Vienna Rules on International Treaties. Therefore, incorporated or not, it binds. It isn't alone in framing how a nation treats its children. We live by other international standards, not least the European Convention on Human Rights, which lives in our Human Rights Act and which applies to children. Tenets in both the European Convention and our Human Rights Act apply to the dignity and the age appropriateness of what we do for all of them. We also signed in 2010 the EU Convention on Child-Friendly Justice, which covers both family and criminal courts. We are parties to the UN Convention on the Ending of Violence Against Women and the EU Treaty on Ending the Sexual Abuse and Exploitation of Children and Young People. Clearly, there are therefore many benchmarks against which we might all reflect on how well we do as a civilised nation. But for all we've ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, this far wider range of international standards and instruments, I'm not convinced that we know what they all mean for policy making, or indeed how as a society we should engage seriously and calmly in a discourse about childhood, particularly as it relates to adolescence. We understand reasonably well what we mean when we envisage or describe a child. We seem as a society less convinced about, and many of us less aware of, the deeper meanings of the word rights in connection with a child. Unless we work or spend purposeful time with them, we continue to be uncomfortable with what it might mean to promote and protect their rights. We become all too easily involved in stereotypical debates, firstly, about whether children ever have them, and if so, whether they should earn them, presumably on a star chart, and secondly, whether their having them negates the rights of adults or leaves children proclaiming their rights as an excuse for what we choose to stereotype as youthful default. That is, involvement in mischief at best, dangerous bad behaviour at worst. More of that in a minute. We have some questions also to answer, do we not, about an under-18 population who in English law are children when we decide they are, and adults when we deem it convenient. For example, ages of sexual consent for passing your driving test, for drinking alcohol, for smoking, for owning property, for taking out a bank loan, for leaving home with or without consent, for leaving care, for being incarcerated in this type of prison but not that type of prison, for marrying, for joining the army, are completely inconsistent. The implications of all of those milestone moments are hugely significant in any human lifetime, but we live with these contradictions. We don't always do right by our children as a result. In my view, in their view, children should be understood and valued by adult society, and they should be brought up to value and understand what it requires of them. To achieve that balance, it's for adults, who after all are the people in the power in this relationship, to move towards those who have no power, preferably with some understanding of what being a child is actually like. Improving intergenerational understanding lies at the heart of their concerns and comes high on my list too. If you work with children and young people, if your work affects their lives in any way, you should actively seek opportunities to fulfil the UN Convention's articles. If you work in local government, your Director of Children's Services and your lead member, after the most recent revisions to their statutory remits, are now responsible in law for fulfilling the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Ha ha! About time too. Some of the Convention's articles are about very basic rights. If you are aged under 18, you have the right to a registered name. You have the right to be safe. You have the right to hold and follow a religious belief about which you are not discriminated. To be loved, to be nurtured. The UN Committee holds us to account for how we're doing about every 5 years, and it challenges the state party to do more wherever we're found wanting. Any time from January 2014 onwards, the UK government can expect to be called. Are we ready? Let me give you an important headline here in case you're uncomfortable with the word rights. All rights, including the rights of the child, are not waiting to be earned. They are a given. The UN is really clear: when we signed the convention, we made our children rights holders, as well as remaining very vulnerable beings who need our protection and guidance. But I meet them everywhere, and they tell me that their having rights is not about putting them in charge. It is not about subjugating the rights of others. They tell me that if they have rights, then so does everybody around them, and they are mutually responsible for assuring everybody else enjoys their rights, and they can and do explain that if we just grab our rights and ignore those of others, it's highly unlikely we will enjoy what we've stolen. We have to take the convention and its commentaries and use them alongside each other and the frameworks mentioned earlier to inform how we treat our children and young people. But if you replace the word rights with the simpler, less emotive word entitlements, you are closer to the meaning of the convention. Here are some articles in a bit more detail. Article 2 says they are inalienable, indivisible, and unviolable. In other words, you can't steal them, you can't have some and not the others, and they can't be taken away if you've done something wrong. They are rights. You are born with them. If your country has signed the convention, they are yours by right. Article 3 says everything we do has to have the child's best interests at the heart. And if that means adapting to see the world through their eyes, then it's our job to do that. They are as different as we are, and therefore the demands of Article 3 are enormous. Article 6 says every child has the right to develop with the maximum chances to do well in life. That's all of them, including the ones who are the hardest to reach, the hardest to understand or accommodate, even those who are seemingly in possession, indeed holding down a self-destruct button, and I meet many of them in my work. Here's the central one, Article 12. Children and young people, in accordance with their age and stage of maturity, have the absolute right to have their voices heard and taken seriously in every decision made by adults about their lives. That's all children, that's all decisions, and not only where services are child or young person specific, so what their neighbourhood's like, whether there's a bus service, if there is, whether they pay full fare at 15, what adults are talking about when they discuss really important issues about the family, the community, the wider world. Guided and mentored, children's views can and do add positively to adults' decisions. In line with Article 12, every year we run a thing called the Children's Commissioners Takeover Day. Last year, about 50,000 children and young people, about 1,200 organisations, all the way from small businesses to the Deputy Prime Minister, took part in that day. It does exactly what it says on the tin. Children and young people are brought into the places where adults make decisions, and they are sat in the adults' chairs. They are not there to make the tea or do the photocopying, they are there to take decisions. So last year, 90 children worked with the Royal British Legion because we worked on Remembrance Day. 6 of them were at the Royal National Memorial Arboretum just up the road from here and worked alongside Grant Howell's architects to completely redesign the learning area at the Arboretum because they knew what children would be interested in. 2 came with me to the Silence in the Square, in Trafalgar Square, to meet veterans. 2 worked behind the scenes at the Albert Hall for the Royal Festival Parade. We had people in businesses, cathedrals, councils, MPs' offices, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, fire and rescue services, sitting alongside police chiefs. What adults say is they bring new and fresh and fantastic ideas, and what children say is, isn't adult life hard? Job done. If you didn't do it, please do it this year, Friday the 23rd of November. Guidance is on my website. If you're in a school, you'll already have been bombarded. You're about to get bombarded again. It's dead easy. All the forms and permissions are on my website, including draft press releases where you just have to drop the name of your place into the press release. Please do it. It's the same day this year as the United Kingdom Youth Parliament will take over the floor of the House of Commons. A fully elected body from all over the country, right round the UK, more diverse, more different than the Commons will ever be. The Speaker chairs that debate, and they are brilliant. If you've not watched it, it makes fantastic TV. All children aged 0 to 18 are vulnerable. That is simply because they are children. They are not in charge. They are not in power. Some of them may think they are. Humans, after all, being born to learn most things by making mistakes and pushing boundaries. But those boundaries are for the adults in their lives to set, for children's safety as much as any other reason. Children do not write the laws that affect, either positively or negatively, every aspect of their lives. This is not their playing field to level. It's ours. So, one piece of proposed law on cooperative parenting after familial separation, we were part of the organisations that advised government that, first of all, it's already in the law. It's in the 1989 Children Act. It's already in the convention that if it's safe and a child wishes to do so, that child should have continued contact with both parents after a familial separation. There is no need further to legislate, and if there is further legislation, the danger of children being what they describe to me as billiard balls or cards in a pack will not necessarily be safeguarded against. Do watch out for that piece of law, because it will be in the new Children and Families Bill, against the advice of children and young people who have lived through the difficulty. The point of that anecdote is that the right is not the adult's. The right is the child's. That's the right in the 89 Act, and it's the right in the Convention. It is not the adult's right. It's the child's. So if you want to write to your MP, get out your pen. We do have a bit of a difficulty in having a calm debate about children. We still have some parts of the media that continue, against plain evidence, to tell the majority of the population we could label frightened but fine, like doctors call us the worried well, that we have reared an entire generation of teenagers, all of whose members are up to no good. That prejudice breeds suspicion. It leaves an abiding fear that any group of young people who are clustered under a streetlight because that's where they can read their digital screens, all of whom have their hoods up, given it's November, so their ears are quite cold. What they're actually doing, of course, ladies and gentlemen, is planning the crime of the century. Because there's 3 of them, so they must be. Or that, as one 17-year-old told me only 18 months ago, the fact I'm with a group of my friends but I'm on your street and it's after dark obviously means we are, in fact, an organised crime syndicate. Actually, what it means, Maggie, is that I'm having a night off from being a young carer for my disabled brother. I just happen to have a lot of friends, and we like meeting outdoors. In 2009, a group of young people working with my opposite number in Northern Ireland ran a really big media survey for an entire week. Every publication, every broadcast in the province was scrutinised, and here were the results. Under 11s were universally portrayed as little angels. Everybody aged 12 plus was universally portrayed as a demon. That was in press across the entire province. Therefore, I put it to you, and here's my latest theory. In the summer holiday between leaving primary school and starting secondary, children clearly enter and undergo a cocoon experience and emerge as monsters. In a London survey, the city's populace was asked what percentage of adolescents they estimated were engaged in violent crime, and the city's populace said 30%. 30% of London's teenagers is 550,000. I put it to you that if 550,000 young Londoners were engaged in violent crime, nobody would ever go to work. The actual percentage in London? Under 1. Now, if it's under 1 in London, I ask you, what is it likely to be in rural Staffordshire? And then shall we all get real? Such casual and unfeeling stereotyping and negativity feature very prominently in the issues that youngsters raise with me, and it is my responsibility and yours to address them. When did we buy as a society? How do we persist in sustaining the myth that every adolescent is a ne'er-do-well? How many of you know a teenager or two? You don't need to put your hands up. Are the teenagers you know villains? Are the teenagers of the people you know villains? Are the teenagers of the people of the other people that they know villains? Okay then, it must be everybody else's. Can we have a calm, sensible and reasoned debate about this? Or are we going to carry on just hurting them? Because they've gone beyond anger, they've gone beyond protest, they are just hurt. We live in crucial, you might believe, as sometimes I do, very overbusy policy-making times. Tonight isn't long enough for all the debates we might want to have. So I want to focus on how they're faring in periods of adversity and remind you that I mean not just the austerity we're living in now, but other adversities that face them. What about the austerity climate, however? The stark evidence for the 16 to 24-year-old population is that they are hit harder than any other age group by the austerity climate in which we now live. Analysis of and commentary on what children and young people face is legion. From Ipsos Mori surveys to Children's Society surveys to Save the Children's work, it comes at us wave after wave. Please keep across it. Don't let yourself get bored with it, because it matters. And the evidence being gathered is already stark, and potentially it will grow. The duty to keep across it and to keep reminding policymakers that we have said it's going to be awful and what are they going to do about it lies with everybody. In January, I published a children's rights impact assessment on the welfare reform bill. I took it to ministers in person and have reminded them about it since. That analysis highlighted grave concerns and fully evidenced predictions for the future potential impact of that bill on children's rights. These issues are shared by my fellow commissioners in all 3 other UK nations, but the impact assessment was England-specific, as is most of my work. We focused in it on identifiable groups of children whose rights are likely to be breached by the implementation of the reforms coming next year. Our assessment was put to the government to point out the need to ensure compliance with children's rights obligations. We have not been successful in turning back the government's intentions, but they've got it now, which means that every 6 months or so I can have another go. And I shall. One of the drawbacks of my role is that I cannot direct, I do not write laws, I do not write policy, I make challenges. We pointed out in that impact assessment that children cannot claim their own benefits. Children do not take advantage of the incentive to take up work. Children do not make the decision to move to cheaper housing. Children are not responsible for the adults in their houses complying with benefits requirements. They are particularly vulnerable to the effects of poverty caused by marked reductions in families' benefits and powerless to affect, but potentially worst affected of anybody, by the changes inherent in the bill on which we commented. They are least able to influence their families' changing future circumstances. All 4 UK commissioners are sufficiently concerned that we are pressing government to work better with us on all of these grave matters. Their comparative reluctance to respond, indeed their reluctance to even to believe the predictions, does not stop us from continuing to press. But those reforms must be seen in the context of many others, including changes to access to legal aid contained in legislation that went through Parliament at almost the same time. So, advice on welfare benefits, access to legal representation before benefits tribunals, both are excluded from access to civil legal aid by that legislation, except for exceptional circumstances. So is legal advice on domestic violence, which could mean that vulnerable women and children are staying, and indeed some vulnerable men and boys, are staying with perpetrators because they cannot get the legal aid they need to get help to move somewhere else. I strongly supported hoped-for amendments to that bill to restore cases to scope, both for children and adults whose children depend on them. Continued concessions are happening. For example, last week, a very recent one, that said they would continue to allow legal aid for families whose child's brain or physical injury was caused by clinical negligence in publicly funded services. But there's far more still to do, and vulnerable children's voices must be heard. We emphasised particularly the levels of poverty and vulnerability common among children whose families receive benefits, but who are living in homes where actually both adults work. They're just on very low pay. The situation they live in, described by a young person to me as relentless and grinding, has a serious impact on the well-being and the rights of the child. About 6 months ago, UNICEF published an Innocenti report card number 10 on finding different ways to measure poverty across the developed Western nations, other than just counting numbers of pounds in your pocket. It makes very sobering reading. It looks at a list of characteristics of deprivation or comfort. It does look at income, and that remains a key matter, but as well as that, it presents this list. Here are some of the items on that list about which I'd ask you to think. Put yourself in the shoes of the child who can't answer or who answers no to these questions. Do you have 2 pairs of shoes? When winter comes, will you have a coat? If a friend comes to see you after school, can they stay for tea? If they wanted to stay overnight with you, could you sleep them and give them breakfast tomorrow? Do you personally have 3 nutritious meals a day where at least 1 contains protein? Do you have appropriate toys indoors and out? Are there books appropriate to your age and stage of development in your home? Can your family let you celebrate a birthday with even a small number of friends? Or go on a trip from home or from school, or go to the cinema? This is only partly about income. Some of it may be about choices made by adults in your home. But that list is and will remain a damning indictment of a Western society where 3.8 million children would answer no to most of those questions. Lest we forget, analysts remind us if we think of some of the families who are drowning, not waving, who are struggling, we have only just begun. 80% or more of the planned reductions in support services they rely on have yet to begin. More than 60% of disabled children in this country now, tonight, are about to lose major parts of their benefits. No, this is not Dickens or Hogarth's London, but our rights impact assessment was by no means an empty prophecy. It predicted some families will very simply struggle to keep a roof over their heads and food on their plates in times to come. Now let's look at health. Poverty and ill health have long been linked, and by many researchers, no doubt some of them here at Keele. Those links have been recorded statistically and by practitioners observing and working with poor families. From the starkest analyses by public health professionals over years and years, we know that the gap in life expectancy between the most and least affluent wards in a city like Stoke are likely to be between 13 and 17 years. So some people will die at 63 and some people will die at 80. That's what that means. In the poorest and most complex of England's communities, whether they're dense urban, scattered rural or shifting coastal ones, life-limiting physical conditions and disability, obesity and poor general health are higher than they are in affluent places. So are reported instances of domestic violence, reported drug or alcohol dependency, cardiovascular and other life-limiting conditions, smoking-related ill health, premature and low birth weight babies, infant mortality, child and adolescent as well as adult depression and mental health issues. Low levels of property ownership, educational qualifications above GCSE, professional employment status, the holding of a simple bank account, dental health, the likely of a regular holiday, however near to home. All of those grinding, relentless and insoluble downward pressures apply, and in some communities they've applied for a long time and will continue to do so. What do we do now to build resilience among our children? How does their community believe in and act on that belief that they are not somebody else's responsibility, they're everybody's? Those questions lie at the heart of whether they will thrive or fail. If we're in it together, we must live and make policy and practice as if we believe we are. Otherwise, the gaps will widen and we will spend a generation picking up the bits. Dramatic? Maybe. Real? I'm going to focus on one more of the many indicators of extreme adversity that affects some children. Very sadly, for them and for us, some young people do become closely involved in youth justice and criminal justice systems. We have to continue to engage in difficult discussions about them and the system against the benchmark of the United Nations Convention. You won't be surprised to hear that I stand for a child rights-based approach, measured against that convention. We are criticised regularly by the United Nations on how we label, try, arrest, punish and/or rehabilitate children and young people who are involved. The government has stated a wish to move towards more community-based and rehabilitative work with those who commit crime. That has to apply to children and young people as well as adults. So, Articles 37 and 40 of the Convention are central. They say that if you're under 18, you should be tried in a way you understand. They don't say you'll never commit a crime. They say if you do, you should be tried in a way you understand. Nations should look for and seek to tackle the social, economic and familial reasons why young offenders do what they do. On my behalf, my deputy has visited almost all of the secure settings in this country. And as she says, whenever she's done some work in this area, she has yet to meet a child from a steady, stable, together background. To meet a young person serving time who has no dark story to tell is something she has never done. Those involved with the criminal justice system under 18 are overwhelmingly the children of poor circumstances. That's the Youth Justice Board's numbers, not mine. They come from the groups in school who don't achieve, don't attend, don't learn much. Those who've been excluded and never went back. They come from the groups at whom, when medics see them, they present speech and language difficulties, neurological difficulties, developmental difficulties, drink and drug-related pathologies. Young offenders we meet tell us very clearly they know what they've done, they recognise their guilt, and they do believe they're serving time because they've done wrong. But let me just remind you that the youngest securely incarcerated English child who slept behind bars last night was 10. We can leave that discussion for another day, but we need to have it. The Convention's clear. Society has a duty to divert children on the edge of involvement, to deal with them pre-arrest, to arrest them as a last resort. It challenges to seek the reasons as well as punishing them when punishment is relevant. Rehabilitation must be our prime concern. Last night, in England and Wales, around 1,600 children slept in secure accommodation behind locked doors. If I'd been standing here a year ago, it would have been 2,000. So we are moving in the right direction. Some of them went to sleep relatively close and others many miles from their families. Some had committed, let me emphasise, truly heinous crimes. Some of these children are incarcerated for their own and others' safety. They are placed exactly where they and where we need them to be. In many such settings, they receive very close adult supervision from supportive role models. They are given therapy and help as well as containment. They are educated and kept safe and treated. For these children, incarceration turns round their lives, improves their literacy, shows them a new way. But we cannot be getting it right if 7 out of 10 of them, on release, reoffend within a year. Some of them haven't committed a serious offence at all. Most children in secure estate settings are there on remand, not yet sentenced, could be acquitted, may never be sent to prison. Many will be there because of an escalation over many years of petty offences. In the very worst cases, Those who were behind bars last night arrived where they are now in the middle of the night after a very long journey, or will have been got up at the crack of dawn this morning because they have a court appearance or are moving to another prison. The standard for how long they spend out of their cells, these are children, in a 24-hour period is 10 hours. In secure settings, as a last resort, and once de-escalation has failed, children can be physically restrained, including through the planned infliction of pain as a means of control. They can be strip-searched, which sounds like what it is. Thanks to our intervention and thanks to our report on mental health about a year ago, those strip searches are no longer routine. They can be placed in strip cells, which are exactly what they sound like: bare concrete walls, a mattress, nothing else. Look at them. Remember, they may be as young as 10, though the very young ones are in secure children's homes, not youth prisons. But even there, the doors are still locked, and movement around the building is via a succession of locked corridors and doors. Most children who end up in secure settings are already known to education support, social care, medics, including the 1 in 4 who end up in young offending populations who've been in the care of the state. If you have a parent who's convicted of a crime, you are 66% more likely than your friends to commit a crime yourself. Who's intervening? Above the average in their cohort have special needs, including poor literacy, speech and language problems, including processing as well as production. They often start at an absolute cognitive disadvantage in a legal setting where language is adult, arcane, and specialist. More than their standard cohort have diagnosable mental health conditions. More have a developing or even an established dependency on drink or drugs. Many experience court processes they will struggle to understand. We are bound not only by the United Nations Convention, but by rules passed in Beijing in 1985 and in Riyadh and Havana in 1990 to stop doing what we're doing. They give us the basis for going forward. They already exist and they express best practice. They're based on the notion that children and young people are vulnerable, that those who offend are usually doubly vulnerable, victims as well as perpetrators, and that they all deserve to have their rights addressed. I would, however, close with a reminder of the realities out there, lest you run away with the idea that I believe we are all deliberately doing our children dreadful wrongs, or that all of them live lives that are as hard and as worrying as the worst. On the contrary, they face massive challenges. So do we as a nation. But by far the majority of England's 11.8 million children are in fact safe and sound, as you and I are in this lecture hall tonight. Most are very well parented. Most are much beloved by the people closest to them. Most are very well taught in very good schools. Most live lives as healthy, balanced, contributing young citizens living in warm and secure and loving homes, made more than ready to face life challenges, made resilient with what one child told me he would call bounce-back ability. Most of them, when they venture beyond home, are very well supported and very well worked with by trusted adults who understand children and who, the revelation of the century, work with children because they like them. Some of them are far needier, far more challenged, could be challenging, far more troubled, could be trouble. Among that group, all too often, are the children of the poor. There is then a tiny minority of England's children who are massively damaged, likely to do themselves or others serious harm unless we turn them round. They are small in number, but I contend that getting things wrong for them means getting things wrong, full stop. It's in that light that I go on challenging us to decide what to do about dealing with their problems and delivering their rights. If this is a big society, whatever you think of that concept, and if that society is to bear fruit, As a nation, we must fulfil the promises we made when John Major signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1991. If we use it to remind us to listen to and believe in our children and young people, we can and will enable them to be all we would wish for their lives. And now I'll take questions.
Maggie, thank you very much for a passionate and thought-provoking talk, and a real defence and champion for our children. And after all, children are our future in many ways as a nation. Maggie's very kindly agreed to take a few questions. There are roving microphones on either side of the lecture theatre, so if you would like to put your hand up, and lady here in the front. And then if you could just say who you are, please, name and affiliation would be helpful.
Thank you, Ram.
Thank you, Maggie. I enjoyed that enormously. Very heartening to hear somebody sticking up for our young people. I'm Jane Essex. I'm a PGC tutor at Keele. And I was wondering to what extent you felt we did ourselves a grave disservice by defining children and childhood in such age-specific ways. And I asked partly in the light, I host a chemistry festival once a year, and I have deliberately aimed it at a wider audience by saying it's for Key Stage 3 functionality rather than Key Stage 3 ages. And we have had the great pleasure to me of seeing 19-year-old people really at the end of their special schools career who are just creeping in towards Key Stage 3 thinking. And I think, how often do we serve these children badly by saying, because you've lived on our planet 12 years, 2 months, so you ought, if you're normal, to be able to da-da-da.
I hope everybody heard that question. Are we defining childhood wrongly by trying to stick to ages? I think we are very ambivalent about when a child is a child and when an adult is an adult. The up to 18 definition is the United Nations definition. Our definitions are all over the place, as I said in my talk. My remit covers the United Nations age range, plus if you have a learning disability or a physical disability, or you have been in the care of the state, up to 21. We have petitioned very hard for it to go up to 25 for those very particular age groups in the new legislation. Whether it will or not, I really don't know. And whether it will be me standing here or somebody else, I also don't know. So, live with uncertainty. Other questions or reflections? Make it easy, Sharon.
Yeah, no, it's just... I just like your views on... I sort of live in a sort of semi-rural place, and I've a teenager myself, and I came sort of head-to-head moving to this place, and we were excited and lived opposite a park, and I thought it was great. Children went to play in the park, sort of age between 14 and 18 at that time. I could see them from the house, and up the road when the neighbours threatened to call the police. And I just wonder, this is something that we're kind of living in an ASBO culture, where, like you say, children are kind of criminalised just because they are hanging around together, yet they need safe places to go. And that age group has nowhere to go. They're not quite adults, not quite children. And I don't know, I just quite like your thoughts on where we're going with that.
When I was a director of Children's Services, we got, like most local authorities, we got a grant to improve some of our play areas, particularly adventurous play, in some of our big parks. And we got a fantastic response from the communities as we built, galleons and rope wires and zip trails and all the rest of it. Until I got a phone call one Friday afternoon, which my PA insisted on putting through, from a neighbour whose house overlooked a park. And she said, I kid you not, "Way, pet, you know that play area like what you've built?" "Yeah." "There's kids playing on it. I need you to come and sort it out, because it's not on." I said, "Why do you think we built it?" Silence. silence at the other. It seems to me, I mean, that's just a very flippant, you know, I said we built it so they could play, and if you don't like it, just get some big curtains. Don't look, Ethel. Yes, the titters of the people who remember the Streaker song. We're very old. An awful lot of localities have got to the stage where, because it's not statutorily required that they provide places and spaces, some of the services that have suffered most under the spending decisions that have had to be made, sadly, have been youth facilities. Young people tell me they don't always want to go to a building, a place, a thing. They'd rather the youth workers came to them. We had a very wonderful police officer out in the west of Gateshead and his equally fantastic mate who worked for the Fire and Rescue Service. And the police officer ran a midnight football league for the teenagers. And we were champions of the region. It was fantastic. And they played football on the multi-use games area behind the comprehensive school where there weren't any neighbours. It was just big open fields. From 11:30 at night until 1:30 in the morning, 3 nights a week. And they were all aged 16 to 19. And his fire and rescue guy, they were out on the rural edge of the borough and there was a lot of forestry, and the fire and rescue guy taught the kids how to build safe dens which didn't involve setting fire to things. That was useful. For me, it's about thinking imaginatively, you know. Had your neighbour ever met your children? Right.
We live in a village where there's lots of woodland.
The microphone,
So the village has a huge bus stop where the kids, then that's where they go next. And then they're turfed out of there, and then there's a wood nearby. So they all go to there. And because it's dark and it's a bit creepy, they tend to light fires. And that's the progression. They go, and the neighbours know they've never met yeah.
You see, that for me, when kids talk to me about this, what they say is, you know, old people don't understand us. And if you talk to them for long enough, what they also say is, we don't understand them very well either, do we? Enlightened local authorities, I told you about this when I was round at your setting earlier on. We had about tuppence halfpenny and some very good will. And we ran sessions in Gateshead called Soul Soup. I'm sorry I'm talking about Gateshead so much. It's the last place where I was actually a direct practitioner. They were called Soul Soup because the old people in a community taught, it was facilitated by a youth worker and a community centre manager in each of the communities where it happened. The old people taught the young people how to make hearty, fulfilling, filling, interesting broths, soups, stews. And as they chopped the vegetables, they told stories about Grandad and Mum and Christmas and why this soup was important and how you made it go further with a bit of pearl barley and the whole thing. And the kids taught their grandmas, granddads and their generation how to tweet, blog, talk to their grandchildren in Australia on Skype, set up a Facebook page that wasn't going to be invaded by millions of people claiming to be your friend, and all the rest of it. And at the end of the session, they ate together. Not that far from here, in the Derbyshire, Staffordshire Dales area, there was a group of young people who were skateboarding next to a British Legion club, and the British Legion people didn't like it. And the council said, well, we're going to build them a skateboarding ramp anyway. And what the kids did was go away and find the one older person in that group who would talk to them. And together, when they painted the murals on the edges of the skateboarding ramps, they were poppies. And the Legion and the young people worked together to make it happen. Now, I don't know whether that's survived. For me, it's about enlightened local authorities and enlightened clubs and churches and mosques and other communities deliberately stepping into the space that says, we will make it safe for the old and the young to meet and to learn from each other and to understand and to respect each other. Really good comprehensive schools open their art classes and their exercise classes and their assembly halls to the old people in their communities. Open their 20th century history classes to old people who remember what it was like to live on the docks in the war, or that were tiny children going to school through the middle of the Blitz. And what the spin-off of that is that you stand in the post office queue or the bus queue and you don't diss each other because you've worked together. But it takes time and it takes effort. It doesn't take a lot of money, but it takes time and effort. And it's about commitment.
Still time for a few questions. Steve.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Steve.
Thanks very much for a very inspiring, if rather depressing, litany of practices. Ruth Levitas wrote a book a few years ago in which she looked at the poor and the way in which we thought about them, the sort of discourses we used. And she distinguished between MUD, the moral underclass discourse, which I think you suggested our media and press certainly use in relation to young people and children. The social inclusion discourse, Sid, which I think you've just been talking about in one particular way, one dimension, with the intergenerational work that sounds wonderful. The third one, which I think you've alluded to really in discussing child poverty and the experience of imprisonment in various ways, I think relates to this point about institutional change and probably cultural change, which is to do with redistribution. Your role and the rights-based approach, where does it have most leverage, do you think?
The change that we've managed to bring about since I became Commissioner has been in very small things that affect very small numbers of children and young people. So we were part of the movement that got the Yarlswood family unit for immigration detention prior to deportation closed. Because it was a prison in which, because your family was about to be deported, you were imprisoned if you were a child. The new system is better. It's still detention, but it's detention for the shortest possible period. And we do drop in unannounced and say, let me in, I need to talk to these families. We've managed to winkle change out of parts of the youth justice system. If I tell you that adolescent boys in youth offending institutes, before they were locked up, so breakfast is kind of 7 in the morning, lunchtime is kind of 11:30, and it's, you know, it's the sort of packed lunch that you would expect to take into school. Evening meal is, in most YOIs that we visited, somewhere between 5 and maybe 6:30, and then it's basically, you know, get yourselves ready, it's bedtime. In many YOIs, what was happening was that as you went to bed, in order to ensure that you didn't need endless numbers of staff on the following morning, you were given your breakfast pack. If you're an adolescent boy and the last time you ate was kind of 5:30, 6:30, what you'll do at 2 o'clock in the morning is eat your breakfast, which means that you won't eat again until lunchtime, which is kind of 11:30. Now, I don't know how many adolescent boys you know, but most of the ones I've ever met would not actually be all right with that long a gap between what you have to eat. We actually managed to work with the Youth Justice Board and those who run those institutions to stop the practice of giving breakfast packs before you lock the population away. Breakfast is at breakfast time. So at least you begin the morning. So it's tiny, tiny things. You know, we got the government to write into the new exclusions guidelines for schools. Because we said we were going to publish and we were going to be critical, they finally wrote into the new guidance that the voice of the child who's being excluded needs to be heard, as well as the voice of the children who are accusing or the staff who are accusing. So when you say, where's our greatest leverage, we tend to have very small victories that kind of put wedges into the system. We are now at the point where ministers can and do say, Commissioner, can you give us your views ahead of the legislation? Or are you going to do a rights assessment on this or this or this? When I first arrived in 2010, I don't think they would have dreamed of doing that, and that was under the last government. There is a minister now with the United Nations Convention as part of his remit. You know, it's step by step. If I were a pessimist, I'd have given up. Because we don't get sweeping wholesale tsunamis of change driving in front of us. You know, I am not Joan of Arc. Well, look what happened to Joan of Arc. Anyway, we do what we do by holding up the mirror of conscience to the nation's policymakers and to the nation's practitioners and saying, it is not good enough. Come on. What do you mean you didn't recognise that this or this or this were happening in the life of this child or this population of children? Of course you did. You just didn't want to see. No, I'm telling you. And people, they don't flinch and they don't run away, but they do stop and think and pause. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get to the point, at some point in my lifetime, where the rights of the child are taken first in the thinking of policymakers. Would it be any better if I wasn't here? I think it would be worse. And that's the thing that keeps me getting up and going to work. And now I think we should take one final one and then stop. Oh, we've got two.
Let's just take
Yeah.
two,
Thank you. Councillor Gwen Hassel for Stoke-on-Trent, Cabinet Member for Social Care. I agree with you, it would be good if we could do small, bite-sized changes. But with the welfare reform, I don't think we're going to have that luxury. And I know we discuss about young children being referred to care. We were containing the position and we budgeted for it. But we're told now by officers that that's going up. And I'm sure with the welfare reforms next year, it's going to increase even more, which is going to be a great strain on our budgets. You know, I know you personally can't wave a magic wand, as you spoke about earlier. But, you know, can you give us some guidance as lay people, local councillors, how we're going to cope with these welfare reforms, particularly in the light of children?
That is a really, really difficult one because you don't know where it's going to hit worst and you don't know which families are going to prove against every expectation that they are more resilient than everybody thought they were. I would say the best advice I can give to any local authority is to work with the people who are closest to the ground where your families are in the greatest difficulty. And they may well be tiny charities on a street corner somewhere, food banks, you know, organisations that are seeing the signs of real difficulty among families on the ground where they're working now. People who can't put money in the electricity meter, primary school teachers who are saying, whoa, there's a lot more children arriving in school hungry or tired or whatever. And then I think if there is any further leeway, it's very likely to be among the sacred cows. How many buildings have you got? Do you use them all? Do you use them all the time? Have you got communities where there is a community centre and a youth centre and a library and an extended school? In which case, why have you got a community where there is a community centre and a youth centre and a library and an extended school? Because if you've got all four, you bet your bottom dollar they are not washing their faces. So shut some. Sell them. You know, I'm serious. I'm serious. As a nation, let's have the debate. If at my doctor's surgery I can get simple day surgery, mole removal, extremely fantastic blood testing and all the rest of it, why do I need a cottage hospital? Sorry. If we're seriously in the trouble that we think we're in, and all three parties are in conference, last week, this week, next week, none of them have got answers. None of them. And, you know, what started under the last government is accelerating under this one. I'm not sure how different it would be if the flag was flying a different colour over Westminster. We have to get to the stage where we are seriously saying the pips will squeak no further. And that will be really hard for communities. You know, I did close schools where people stood foursquare across the doorway and said, my granddad laid that foundation stone, and over my dead body are you closing this school? And they were horrible, horrible, horrible days. But we couldn't do anything else. Take the really hard decisions. And then you've got some leeway with government. But get your allies. You know, where's the health service? Are they putting their hand in their pocket to do what needs to be done for the children of this borough? In which case, hold them to ransom. Because it's their responsibility as well as yours. Tough ones though, Councillor. I do not envy your position. Hello.
Hi, thanks for the talk, it's good. I apologise if I'm ill-informed, But I come from a background, a one-parent background, who meddled about with drug and alcohol misuse and has mental health problems. Me and both my sisters have never been offered any help. And at the time when I was about 16, 17, and I was doing petitions and stuff for local rehab centres and things, that like the O'Connor Centre in Newcastle, which has opened, after one just got closed. At that time, Stoke-on-Trent was the 3rd worst place for alcohol and drug misuse in the whole country. And there was 3 of us, and there was never... Oh, there's ADSIS, but that's a charity. But there was never any help. There was no checkups. Not that we would have definitely had it, but I know other families and things, and where it is quite common, especially in Stoke-on-Trent, and there was never any follow-up. And maybe this is a reason for kids not going to school or having mental health problems, but there was never anything. So I just want to know where that is. And
you're telling a story that I am told everywhere I go by young people who have struggled to be at school and get their qualifications whilst also being principal carers for others in their households. My line to government has been throughout, children are not there to be carers. The system has to step in. Young carers save the country billions a year, I would say. And the youngest young carer I ever met was 6 and had been looking after her mum for a long time, since she was 4 or 5. You are turned a blind eye to, and I've said that to government as well. You are not listened to, you are not heard. And the Children's Society and others are campaigning very heavily on behalf of children who end up in positions where they should not be caring as if they were an adult for an adult in their lives. Has it changed? Has it got any better? It's patchy, I would say. There are places in the country where young carers are brilliantly supported and where there are specialist workers and where there are drug and alcohol workers who'll go in alongside and stop them from being the person who's looking after their mum or their dad. But it's not everywhere in the country, and it sounds to me as if it's not right here yet either. And that's an everybody responsibility. That's social care and education and health and charities supposedly working together. There are some places in the country that have really got it sorted, and young carers do not carry that weight on their own. But an awful lot of places in the country have not got it right. There are charities, Prince's Trust for Young Carers, Crossroads Care, but it's whether you can get a worker, it's whether you can get somebody to come and help. I take my hat off to you if you've been a young carer and you've got yourself to university. I think that's brilliant.
I don't have any self-sympathy, but I just know a lot of people haven't gone to uni.
Yeah.
Not necessarily have self-sympathy, but it's not just someone to come in and take care of it. It's to teach the kids that they don't have to do that.
Yeah.
They are still a kid. And
Yeah. You shouldn't have to lose your childhood.
And just
yeah.
If you do that, doesn't mean you can't go to university, you can't go to college. I think they miss out.
They miss out enormously. Young carers I talk to are quite open in telling me that they consider they've lost their childhoods. They were made into playing an adult role when they were very young. And it's not fair. And there are, we think, and this is the best estimate because some young carers never say, we think there are about 300,000 of you across England. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how much money are 300,000 children saving the nation in looking after either disabled or sick parents or disabled or sick siblings? It is an issue. It's not gone away. The 4 commissioners continue to push on it, but it's convenient to let children continue to care, and it's not on. It's not on. Blimey, that was a tough one to end on. But thank you for asking. Colleagues, thank you so much.
This is the point at which I normally smile and say, what a fantastic talk you've given us. But you have actually given us a lot of food for thought on a very serious subject. I could sense and see from, in a sense, the expressions on the audience that, we collectively are moved by some of the things you have said. And this is really a very serious topic and is something which, I think all of the people in the room, clearly have an interest in, are committed to. children are very much the future of our society, and at least we know that we have somebody right at the top in our organisational structure in the country who's actually really cares for children and who's a real champion for children. And that's come through today in your talk, Maggie. Maggie has, for those of you who don't know, given up really the whole day here at Keele today, starting this morning with the opening of our nursery, which was a very nice and fun occasion. And is here again, all through the day and this evening later on as well, for a discussion. So we're very grateful for you giving up the whole day. Thank you for a very thought-provoking thought. I think you've left a lot of people, thinking about a number of these things, and I'm sure we will take this back into our day jobs, where that's applicable. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you.